Most of the plants we're growing in our vegetable garden, like the beans and the lettuce and the cucumbers and the chard that are in this bed right here, will begin their lives and end their lives in the same growing season. And for many of them, I've got a wide window of opportunity. I can start the seeds early, I can start the seeds late, and I can still get a harvest. But what about those plants that take a long time to develop and a long time to grow? When you start them, it makes a difference. Join me today as I share with you 5 plants that you'll wish you started sooner. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and this is just my 3rd year in this garden space. I moved in almost exactly 3 years ago and began planning and building this garden space. Of course, I started growing those vegetables as soon as possible, but I recognized as I was going to build out this entire area that I needed to act quickly to get certain plants in the ground as soon as possible, because they were going to take a long time to mature, a long time to reach the point that I get the benefits from those plants. The first being this asparagus. Now, I put this asparagus in the ground 2 years ago, and it's actually looking pretty good. One of the things you do with asparagus in the first couple years is let them grow. Let these fronds develop so that the energy of the sun can be transmitted through photosynthesis into the roots below. And then in the spring, those delicious asparagus spears will appear. And it's incredible to harvest those young, fresh, tender asparagus spears, take them directly to the kitchen. It's an amazing experience. But when it comes to asparagus, you can't harvest in the first year after planting. Those roots have to get established. You have to allow the plant to develop, and those fronds give the energy for the later years. Like the 2nd year. You really shouldn't be harvesting your asparagus in the 2nd year either. In this year, these beautiful plants gave me lots of spears. I didn't harvest any of them to eat. It's next year, in the 3rd year of this asparagus, that I'll finally be able to harvest. If I didn't put these plants in as early as possible, I would still be waiting beyond next year to be able to enjoy that delicious flavor of the asparagus. If you like asparagus, if you want to grow asparagus, get them in the ground as soon as possible. If you want to grow more than just the vegetables, you need to branch out and think about plants like berries. Berries of all types, berry bushes specifically. And berry bushes will also take years to become established and give you the berries that you're looking for, like this currant bush behind me. Now, I actually brought this currant from my last garden and transplanted it. So it's the first plant I put into this garden, and it's 3 years old, and this year was the first time that I got a substantial number of flowers that would lead to those berries I'm looking for. I also have a currant here and a couple gooseberries that are only 2 years old. And you can see a substantial difference in the size of these 2-year-old plants to this 3-year-old plant. That's why you need to get plants like the berries in the ground as soon as possible, because their mature point, where they're going to start giving you a regular supply of berries, is going to take time. The same with plants like these raspberries. Now, I brought with me from my last garden about 6 raspberry plants and started this raspberry patch. Well, now after 3 years, those heritage raspberry plants have completely filled out this area. And I already have early raspberries developing. This will be the first year that I expect to get a substantial harvest of these raspberry plants. 2 years ago, I added these raspberries, and 1 year ago I added some other raspberries. Over the course of time, this patch will get bigger, these plants will become more robust, and I'll get bigger and better harvests. But if I hadn't put those first plants in the ground 3 years ago, it would look nothing like it does right now, unless I spent a lot of money to buy a lot of individual plants. I prefer to just let them spread and start with a handful of plants, and let time do the rest for me. Don't think that you need to have established garden areas to put some of these plants in. Right here I have some gooseberries. I've got more currants behind me. I've got some aronia, and I've got some honeyberries, all in this same area. Now my plan calls for some really nice brick pathways and a nice pergola right here. But if I waited for those structures to come in and then set up these garden beds and then put the plants in, well, I'd be 4 or 5 years behind where I could be by just putting these plants in the ground early and then let the structures come later. I also have 2-year-old honeyberries and gooseberries in this bed as well. But the center point is another perennial vegetable, and number 3 on my list. It's rhubarb. I have a rhubarb here, and like the asparagus, you shouldn't be harvesting the rhubarb in those first few years. The plant needs to get established. So in their second year in the garden, I'm letting them grow. I'm letting them get established. I'm even letting them flower to feed the bees. Next year, I'll begin harvesting the rhubarb. And this is a plant that is so hardy in most of our gardens. It's almost impossible to kill, and believe me, I've tried. When I harvest this rhubarb, it now becomes available for all kinds of standard dessert recipes to go along with the strawberries that I'm growing in this bed. But my favorite use for the rhubarb is to make rhubarb jelly. And if you haven't had it, you should make it. And it starts by growing rhubarb and growing rhubarb early because of the years it takes before you can harvest. There's a proverb that says the best time to plant a tree is 20 years ago. The second best time is today. And that definitely holds true with these fruit trees that I have growing in this mini orchard. Some of these trees have been in for 2 years now, others have only been in for 1 year. And like all the other plants so far, they'll take years to develop and give me the fruit that I want. I had a couple flowers appear on that plum tree and one of the apple trees after 2 years, but not enough to actually be worthwhile as a harvest. It's going to take 3 to 5 years before these trees give me a substantial harvest, which means you need to get them in the ground as soon as possible. So even though other garden areas around this space have yet to be developed, I put these trees in, I mulched them well, and I'm taking care of them so that at least in my harsh environment, they have a better chance for survival. Because in those years ahead, when I finally reach the point that I can harvest, I'm going to enjoy it and make my jams and jellies and my pies and everything else with this wonderful fruit. I wouldn't be able to do that in 3 years unless I had started some of these plants 2 years ago. Last year was the first year that I started developing this pollinator garden. And flowers, specifically the pollinator flowers, are number 5 on the list. These perennials will come back year after year. And like all of the others, they take time to get established and become the big, robust plants. Now, I had some flowers last year, but I have more flowers this year. And as I look below me, I see a lot of the volunteer plants that are popping up from the seeds that I allowed to drop last year. In time, this whole space will be covered with flowers. And when you're growing those fruit bushes and those fruit trees and many of the plants that you have in your vegetable garden, you want the pollinators. So you need the plants to attract those beneficial insects. If you just put the trees in and just put your vegetable garden in, you'll probably have some success, but you'll have more success if you're growing flowers, flowers of all types throughout the garden space. Now, I'm focused on this area as the main attraction, the magnet to bring in most of the pollinators. But as I develop the rest of my garden space, I'll be adding flowers everywhere, around my vegetable garden beds and even around my fruit trees. This is one of those things that takes time. I don't want to have to buy each of these dozens of individual plants. So look around you. Everything you see, all of these flowers, I started from seed. And that takes time. The sooner you start your flowers from seed, the sooner you can get these perennials in the ground, the sooner you can have an established pollinator garden and attract all those good insects to benefit you and the many harvests to come. 3 years ago, this raised wooden bed was the very first bed I put in this garden, along with my hugelkultur mound, so that I could start growing my vegetable garden. Because for many gardeners, that's our primary focus, to be growing our vegetables during the peak of summer. Well, at the same time, I was also thinking and planning and starting to construct that area behind me so that I could put in the asparagus and the rhubarb and the berry bushes and those perennial plants to attract the pollinators. I was also thinking about that other space to put in those fruit trees. On a day-to-day basis, I was working in my vegetable garden, but those other plants had already started growing because I knew they needed time. Too many new gardeners, and even some experienced gardeners, are only focused on one area of the garden, like the vegetables. Well, try to think beyond that and think about what other plants you might want to try growing along this gardening journey. And it'll probably include some, if not all, of the 5 plants that I've covered today. So rather than waiting, put those plants in today so that a few years down on your journey, you'll be able to enjoy substantial harvests of many things beyond just the vegetables. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.